The first snow came early, sealing the boarding school in white silence and perfect routines. Bells on time, beds made tight, footsteps in lines. 3 girls moved through it like everyone else. President roll call. Seated in class, uniforms crisp, voices steady. Nothing broke. No alarms. No shouting. Just another winter night. Doors closing with familiar clicks. Radiators ticking in the dark. Then morning arrived, and 3 names hung in the air without answers. Beds untouched. Shoes still lined up. Books left open mid-page. Outside, the snow lay smooth beyond the usual paths. No stray tracks. No clear direction. Nothing to follow. The bells kept ringing anyway. The winter arrived early that year. Not with drama, but with quiet insistence. Snow settled over the boarding school like a hell breath, smoothing sharp edges, muting sound, making everything appear calmer than it truly was. From a distance, the campus looked preserved in time, its stone buildings standing obediently beneath a pale sky, their windows glowing faintly at dusk. It was the kind of place parents trusted instinctively, the kind of place brochures described with words like tradition, discipline, and safety. Bells marked the hours. Routines governed the days, and nothing ever seemed to happen that wasn't scheduled, supervised, or sanctioned. Inside, life followed patterns so deeply ingrained they felt eternal. Morning bells rang with mechanical certainty, echoing through corridors that smelled faintly of polish and old books. Girls rose from narrow beds, dressed in uniforms folded the night before, and filed out into hallways where footsteps overlapped like a rehearsed rhythm. The school believed in order the way some places believe in faith. Rules were not merely enforced, they were revered. Silence after lights out, posture at meals, punctuality at roll call. Each detail was treated as proof that the world could be shaped into something predictable. Winter amplified that illusion. Snow kept the outside world at a distance, sealing the campus into itself. Roads became quieter, visits rarer. Letters from home arrived slower, their envelopes cold to the touch. Inside, radiators hissed and clicked, fighting back the chill, while frost traced delicate patterns along window panes. The girls learned to live inward during these months, finding warmth in whispered conversations, shared glances, the small rebellions that never made it into rule books. Laughter still existed, but it was softer now, careful not to carry too far. There were 3 girls who moved through this winter like everyone else, unnoticed in any official sense, yet unmistakably present to those who knew how to look. They blended into the daily choreography of the school, sitting in classrooms with gloved hands wrapped around pens, standing in line for meals, passing each other in hallways with nods that meant more than words. Nothing about them suggested they would become central to a story that would outlive the building itself. They were not legends. They were not warnings. They were simply there. The school did not pay attention to feelings unless they disrupted discipline. Emotional lives unfolded quietly in margins and corners. A folded note tucked into a textbook. A stare held a second too long across the dining hall. A breath caught before answering a teacher's question. These moments left no record. No ledger track fear or longing. No bell announced when something fragile shifted inside a student. The institution functioned as if inner lives were irrelevant, as if obedience were the same as well-being. That winter, the bells kept ringing on time. Morning, afternoon, evening. Their sound carried across snow-covered grounds, reassuring in its regularity. Bells did not miss days. Bells did not hesitate. Bells did not ask questions. They marked time whether or not time made sense. To hear them was to believe that everything was proceeding as it should. At night, the dormitory settled into a careful stillness. Lights dimmed, doors closed. The building creaked as it always had, adjusting to the cold. Some girls slept easily, exhausted by routine. Others lay awake, staring at ceilings, counting cracks, listening to the wind press against the walls. The world beyond the campus felt impossibly far away, as if the snow had erased roads and towns and families entirely. For some, that distance felt peaceful. For others, it felt suffocating. The school prided itself on preparation, preparing girls for adulthood, for responsibility, for endurance. But preparation had its blind spots. There was no curriculum for loneliness that lingered too long. No protocol for fear that didn't break rules. No language for discomfort that disguised itself as obedience. The institution trusted its systems more than its students. If nothing appeared wrong, nothing was wrong. Winter made it easier to believe that. Cold simplified everything. Movement slowed. Curiosity dulled. People stayed where they were told to stay. The outside world faded into abstraction, something discussed in geography lessons or holiday plans. Inside the school's walls, life compressed into a narrow, controlled shape. It was a place where change felt unlikely, where tomorrow looked exactly like yesterday, where permanence seemed guaranteed by repetition. And yet, beneath that surface, something was already fraying, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention. It was the quiet kind of unraveling that only becomes visible in retrospect, a rule enforced without question, a silence left unbroken, a moment when someone noticed something was off and chose, consciously or not, to look away. These moments did not announce themselves as important. They passed like snowflakes melting on a sleeve, gone before anyone thought to examine them. The three girls moved through these days unaware that this winter would become a boundary in time, a before and after that others would measure their lives against. They worried about ordinary things. They planned futures in half-formed sentences. They adapted to the cold, to the rules, to each other. They trusted, as everyone did, that the structure around them existed to protect. On the last ordinary days, nothing broke. No alarm sounded. No doors slammed in warning. The bells rang. Lessons were taught. Meals were served. The snow continued to fall, softening the world, hiding edges, making everything feel quieter, safer, contained. It was a kind of calm that invites complacency, that convinces people they will always have more time to notice what matters. Years later, people would look back and search for signs, for moments that should have felt heavier, darker, more urgent. They would scrutinize memory, asking whether the danger had been visible all along. But in that winter, from inside it, the days felt unremarkable, comforting even. That was the tragedy of it. Nothing about the season announced itself as the last of anything. The bells rang through cold air, steady and indifferent, marking hours that no one yet knew they would one day count backwards. By the time winter settled fully into the campus, the girls had learned each other the way people do when they live too closely together, not through grand confessions or dramatic moments, but through repetition, who lingered by the windows before class, who ate slowly, tearing bread into careful pieces, who wrote letters home, and who pretended not to care when none arrived. Names were read aloud every morning, but identities formed quietly, in habits no roll call could capture. One of the girls carried herself as if she were always observing rather than participating. She listened more than she spoke, her attention drifting to details others ignored. The way teachers' voices changed when rules were questioned, the subtle alliances among students that shifted week by week. She filled the margins of her notebooks with fragments of thought rather than doodles, sentences that went nowhere but meant something to her. When she laughed, it was unexpected and brief, as if she hadn't planned on it escaping. She had learned early that attention could be both a shield and a risk, and she chose carefully when to be seen. Another seemed built out of motion, restless hands, restless feet, a gaze that never lingered long in one place. She tested boundaries not out of defiance alone, but out of curiosity, as if she needed to know where the edges were simply to understand the shape of her world. Teachers noticed her because she asked questions that felt inconvenient, because she smiled at rules like they were puzzles rather than laws. Other students were drawn to her energy, even when it unsettled them. She talked about leaving the school one day with a confidence that sounded like a promise to herself. The third blended in so well that people often forgot how closely they watched her. She followed expectations with practiced ease, her uniform always neat, her posture impeccable. Teachers praised her reliability. Students trusted her with secrets, sensing she would keep them safe. But there were moments, brief and unguarded, when something else surfaced, an exhaustion in her eyes, a hesitation before answering questions about home. She had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming exactly what was expected of you, even when it cost more than anyone realized. They were not inseparable, not the kind of trio that moved as a single unit. Their connection was quieter, woven through shared classes, shared corridors, shared winters. Sometimes they sat together. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they barely spoke for days. What bound them was not constant closeness, but recognition, a sense, however faint, that the other saw something familiar in them, something the school itself did not acknowledge. The boarding school encouraged independence, but only within strict limits. Emotional closeness was tolerated as long as it didn't disrupt discipline. Privacy existed on paper, not in practice. Letters could be read. Rooms could be searched. Friendships were observed with mild suspicion. The girls learned to communicate in glances and pauses, in conversations that appeared harmless on the surface. Trust had to be subtle to survive. Each of them carried a private narrative about why they were there. One believed the school was a necessary exile, a place to wait out a difficult chapter before returning home changed and improved. Another treated it as a temporary challenge, something to endure before stepping into a future she imagined vividly, but never described in full. The third told herself the school was an opportunity, even when the thought felt fragile, as if it might collapse under too much scrutiny. These stories mattered because they shaped how each girl interpreted the same rules, the same walls, the same winter days. Their lives intersected most clearly in moments the institution considered insignificant. Late-night whispers after lights out. Shared looks during assemblies when speeches dragged on too long. Brief exchanges in stairwells, voices low, saying nothing important and everything at once. In these moments, they allowed themselves to be honest in small ways. Complaints softened into humor. Fear disguised itself as sarcasm. Hope appeared only briefly, like a hand warming near a radiator before pulling away. The school's rhythm left little room for deviation. Wake, study, eat, study again, sleep. Days folded into one another until memory blurred. That sameness created a strange intimacy. Everyone knew who cried quietly at night. Everyone knew who pretended not to miss home. Everyone knew which teachers were kind only when no one was watching. Knowledge accumulated without acknowledgement, a collective understanding that lived beneath the official narrative of discipline and success. When the three girls crossed paths, there was often a pause, a shared awareness of the moment. Not dramatic, not sentimental. Just a recognition that they were navigating the same enclosed world with different strategies. One observed, one pushed, one endured. None of them would have described it that way aloud, but the dynamic existed all the same. There were rumors, of course. Boarding schools breed them the way damp walls breed mold. Small stories passed from mouth to mouth, changing shape with each telling. Who liked whom, who planned to leave, who was unhappy enough to do something reckless. The girls heard these rumors and reacted differently. One stored them away, treating them as data. One laughed them off, adding exaggerations of her own. One absorbed them quietly, wondering which version of herself others believed. Despite the closeness forced by shared space, each girl experienced the school in isolation. Loneliness was a personal burden here, not a collective one. You could be surrounded by people and still feel unreachable. The institution offered no language for that feeling, no safe place to name it, so it stayed internal, shaping thoughts in ways no one else could see. As winter deepened, small changes crept in. A girl lingering longer before entering a classroom. Another staying awake later than usual. A third withdrawing just enough to be noticed by someone paying attention, but no one officially was. These shifts did not trigger concern. Adolescence was assumed to be turbulent. Silence was interpreted as maturity. Discomfort was reframed as discipline working as intended. Morning roll calls continued without interruption. Names spoken aloud, answers given. Presence confirmed. It was a ritual that reassured teachers and students alike, a moment where everything seemed accounted for. The girls answered when their names were called, voices steady, bodies upright. No one listening could have guessed how much existed beneath those simple responses. They were still there, still part of the pattern, still absorbed into the machinery of the school. Nothing about them suggested disappearance. If anything, their ordinariness made them invisible in the way institutions often prefer. They complied, they adapted, they survived their days. and in doing so, they became easy to overlook. When people later tried to remember who the girls were, they would struggle to separate memory from hindsight. Every detail would feel weighted with meaning it didn't carry at the time. But in that winter, before everything fractured, the girls were just names on a roll call, moving through cold hallways, believing, like everyone else, that tomorrow would arrive exactly as expected. The night did not announce itself as different. It arrived the way all nights did, sliding quietly over the campus, dimming the windows one by one as study hours ended and dormitory lights were lowered. Snow pressed against the glass in soft, relentless patterns, and the wind threaded itself through the bare trees like a low, distant breath. Inside, the routines held. Shoes were placed neatly beneath beds. Uniforms were folded. Doors closed with familiar clicks. Nothing in the air suggested that this was the last night anything would remain unchanged. Lights out came without resistance. Conversations faded into whispers and then into silence. The building settled, expanding and contracting against the cold. Somewhere, a radiator knocked in protest before finding its rhythm again. Girls drifted toward sleep, their thoughts scattered between the day just past and the one waiting for them in the morning. Some slept deeply. Others lay awake, listening, counting minutes, tracing patterns in the dark. The school had always sounded like this at night, alive in small mechanical ways, but emotionally dormant. At some point, the corridors emptied. No footsteps echoed after curfew. No voices slipped under doors. The watchful stillness the school prized took hold, thick and unquestioned. The adults on duty believed, as they always did, that silence meant compliance, that order had been restored for the night. The idea that silence could mean something else did not cross their minds. Morning arrived not with urgency, but with habit. The first bell rang, its sound sharp against the cold air, bouncing off stone and snow. Doors opened. Girls emerged in stages, sleepy and shivering, wrapping sweaters tighter around themselves as they moved toward the bathrooms and common areas. The usual murmurs returned, low and unremarkable. No one expected surprise. Mornings were predictable by design. It was only after a few minutes that the absences began to register, not as alarm, but as mild irritation. An empty chair in the dining hall, a bed left untouched, its blankets too neatly arranged to suggest sleep. Someone remarked casually that a girl must be running late. Another joke that someone had finally managed to oversleep through the bell. Lateness was rare, but not impossible. No one reached for panic. Not yet. Roll call approached, and with it, the assumption that order would reassert itself. Names would be read. Voices would answer. The ritual confirmed what everyone already believed, that the system worked, that nothing slipped through unnoticed. Teachers shuffled papers. Students took their seats. The room filled with the soft sounds of movement, of chairs scraping lightly against the floor. When the first name was called and no answer followed, there was a pause, so brief it almost went unnoticed. A second call, slightly sharper. Still nothing. A note was made, casual, provisional. The process continued. Another name. Another silence. Then a third. By then, the room had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for people to look up, to exchange glances, to feel the faintest tightening in their chests. Questions followed, but they were cautious, framed in the language of procedure rather than fear. Had anyone seen them earlier? Were they in the infirmary? Had they been granted permission to be elsewhere? The answers came back negative, but still no one reached for the word that lingered unspoken. Missing felt too large, too disruptive, too accusatory. The school preferred explanations that preserved its sense of control. Dormitories were checked with the expectation that the girls would be found mid-routine, perhaps ill, perhaps avoiding something minor. Doors were opened, beds examined, closets scanned. The rooms told stories of interruption rather than departure. Personal items remained. Shoes lined up, books open where they had been left. It was the kind of detail that unsettles only after belief has shifted. At first, it merely confused. The hallways remained quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. It no longer felt restful. It pressed inward, demanding attention. Adults moved more quickly now, voices lower, instructions clipped. Students were told to wait, to stay where they were, to trust that everything was under control. The word control was repeated often, as if saying aloud could make it true. As minutes stretched into an hour, disbelief hardened into unease. The possibility that the girls were not simply late or misdirected began to surface, tentative and frightening. Teachers avoided eye contact with students, as if afraid of what might be reflected back at them. The institution, so confident in its routines, struggled to adapt to uncertainty. Searches began inside first, methodical and restrained. Classrooms, stairwells, storage rooms. The school seemed to fold in on itself, every space suddenly suspect. Yet nothing surfaced. No sign of haste. No sign of struggle. Just absence, clean and complete. The kind of absence that refuses to explain itself. Outside, the snow remained undisturbed. Paths showed the expected traffic of early morning, but nothing more. No erratic tracks. No signs of someone leaving in a hurry. The cold had preserved the surface too well, offering no clues. It was as if the night had swallowed the girls whole and smoothed itself over afterward. Students began to feel it then, the shift from curiosity to fear. Whispers spread despite instructions to remain calm. Speculation bloomed in the gaps left by official silence. Some imagined elaborate explanations. Others retreated inward, suddenly aware of how easily someone could vanish from a place designed to watch so closely. The school no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a question with no answer. The adults moved through the day in a state of strained performance. Classes were canceled. Bells rang anyway, as if refusing to acknowledge that routine had already failed. The sound felt wrong now, too loud, too insistent. Each ring marked time passing without resolution. Each echo a reminder that something fundamental had broken. By afternoon, the word missing could no longer be avoided. It passed quietly from office to office, heavy with implication. Calls were made, procedures initiated. The institution reached outward for help. But even as it did, it clung to the hope that this was a misunderstanding, a temporary lapse that would soon be corrected. Accepting anything else felt like admitting a flaw too deep to name. Throughout it all, the hallways stayed unervingly quiet. No laughter, no casual chatter, just footsteps and doors and the constant, oppressive awareness of what wasn't there. The spaces the girls had occupied seemed to hold their shape, like impressions left behind in snow after someone stands up and walks away. That night, when darkness fell again, it felt heavier than before. The building no longer settled into rest. It waited. Lights remained on longer. Adults paced. Students lay awake, listening not for comfort, but for reassurance that never came. The school, once defined by predictability, had entered a new state, one where silence no longer meant safety, and routine could not explain what had already slipped beyond its grasp. By the next morning, the presence of authority had changed the air. Cars lined the narrow road leading to the campus, their tires crunching against packed snow, engines idling as if uncertain how long they would be needed. Uniforms and heavy coats replaced the familiar silhouettes of teachers and staff. The school, once closed in on itself, was now exposed, its grounds mapped and measured by people trained to look for what others missed. The assumption was simple. If 3 girls had left this place, there would be signs of it. The search began with confidence. Plans were drawn, zones assigned, procedures followed. Snow, after all, was supposed to be an ally. It preserved, it recorded, it remembered. Footprints should have told a story. Direction, pace, urgency. Investigators expected to read the ground like a page. Instead, they found nothing that made sense. The paths leading away from the buildings showed only the expected patterns of daily use. Beyond them, the snow lay smooth and uninterrupted, as though no one had crossed at all. Searchers moved outward in widening circles, boots sinking into drifts as they combed the perimeter of the campus. Trees stood bare and motionless, their branches etched against the sky. The woods, so close and yet so rarely entered during winter, became a focus of attention. Teams moved carefully, calling out names that vanished into the cold air without response. Every shadow invited hope and then denied it. There were no discarded belongings, No torn fabric caught on branches. No signs of a struggle interrupted. The forest offered nothing but silence. Inside the school, a different kind of search unfolded. Rooms were examined with a scrutiny that felt invasive. Drawers opened, mattresses lifted, personal items handled with gloved hands. What emerged was not evidence of departure, but evidence of interruption. The girls had not packed. They had not prepared. Objects remained mid-use, as if time had simply stopped around them. Investigators noted these details carefully, their notebooks filling with observations that refused to assemble into a coherent narrative. The lack of physical clues created an uncomfortable tension. Every hour that passed without discovery made the situation harder to define. The case did not behave the way cases were supposed to. There was no clear starting point, no obvious direction. Even the simplest questions, when did they leave, how did they leave, why, floated unanswered, unanchored to any verifiable fact. Students were questioned next, though the word question felt too strong for the careful conversations that took place. Investigators spoke gently, aware of the age of the girls they addressed and the fragility of the environment they were stepping into. Questions circled around the same themes. Last sightings, unusual behavior, whispered plans. Answers came hesitantly, filtered through fear and imagination. Some students remembered fragments that felt important but couldn't explain why. Others remembered nothing at all, their minds blank in the face of pressure. Teachers and staff underwent similar scrutiny, though the dynamic was different. Authority does not yield easily to examination. Schedules were reviewed, duties confirmed, routines defended. Everyone could account for where they were supposed to be, what they were supposed to be doing. The institution had records for everything, and those records seemed to support the idea that nothing had gone wrong. And yet, something clearly had. As daylight faded, the search expanded again, reaching beyond the campus boundaries into nearby roads and properties. Locals were notified, asked if they had seen anything unusual in the early hours of the morning. Most had not. Winter had kept people indoors, windows shut against the cold. The world outside the school had been asleep, just as insulated in its own routines as the girls had been in theirs. The absence of footprints became a fixation. Snow should have betrayed movement. Instead, it preserved stillness. Investigators debated possibilities quietly among themselves. Had the girls left before snowfall? Had they been transported by someone else? Each theory raised new questions it could not answer. The landscape refused to cooperate, offering no confirmation, no contradiction, only emptiness. As the search continued, fatigue set in, not just physical exhaustion, but a deeper, more unsettling weariness. The kind that comes from working against a void. Searchers repeated patterns, revisited areas, hoping repetition might reveal what the first pass had missed. Hope flared with each small anomaly, then died just as quickly when it proved irrelevant. A fallen branch, an animal track, a shadow that resolved into nothing. Inside the school, the atmosphere grew strained. Students were kept together, their movements restricted under the guise of safety. The familiar rules took on a harsher edge, enforced with more urgency, less patience. Anxiety leaked into every interaction. Some girls cried openly. Others withdrew, watching the adults with a new skepticism. The belief that the school was all-seeing had been shaken, and no amount of reassurance could fully restore it. The families arrived in stages, drawn by fear and unanswered calls. Their presence altered the emotional landscape entirely. Grief had not yet taken shape, but panic had. Parents searched faces for recognition, for reassurance, for any sign that someone knew more than they were saying. They were met with careful words, official language designed to soothe, without promising anything concrete. The gap between what was felt and what was said widened painfully. Days passed, and the search pressed on, but the energy changed. Confidence gave way to determination, and then to something more fragile. The realization crept in that effort alone might not be enough, that some mysteries resist even the most thorough examination. The snow began to feel less like a tool and more like a barrier, its pristine surface mocking the urgency beneath it. Every evening, teams returned with nothing to report. No breakthroughs, no discoveries, just confirmation of absence. The case became defined not by what was found, but by what was missing. Footprints that never appeared, witnesses who saw nothing, a timeline that refused to align. As the operation continued, a quiet, devastating understanding took hold. The girls had vanished in a way that left no physical narrative behind. The landscape offered no memory of them. The school, stripped of its illusions of control, stood exposed and bewildered. The search had revealed the most unsettling truth of all. Not that something terrible had happened in plain sight, but that it might have happened without leaving any trace at all. When the searchers failed to produce answers, something else moved in to fill the space they left behind. Silence does not remain empty for long. It invites interpretation, and interpretation quickly becomes story. The absence of facts created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed explanations shaped less by evidence and more by emotional necessity. People needed the mystery to resolve into something understandable, something that fit the shape of their fears and beliefs. The first stories were hopeful, almost comforting in their simplicity. The girls must have run away together. That idea spread quickly, carried by the logic that youth is restless and rules are suffocating. It allowed people to imagine the girls alive, choosing freedom over obedience, stepping into the world with intention. This version of events cast the disappearance as an act of agency rather than loss. For some, it was easier to believe the girls had escaped than to confront the possibility that they had been taken by something they could not fight. Others built more elaborate narratives. Secret plans whispered for weeks. Hidden relationships no one had noticed. A pact made in desperation or excitement. These stories borrowed details from ordinary teenage behavior and inflated them into explanations. A late-night conversation became a conspiracy. A shared glance turned into evidence of a grand design. The truth mattered less than the coherence of the tale. As long as the story made emotional sense, it was accepted. There were darker theories, too, though they were spoken more cautiously. Accidents covered up, punishments gone too far, authority figures whose strictness masked cruelty. These ideas unsettled the community because they suggested failure not just of individuals, but of the institution itself. To entertain them fully would require questioning the systems people relied on for safety and order. As a result, these theories often stalled halfway, mentioned and then dismissed, left hovering without resolution. The town surrounding the school participated in this storytelling, even if from a distance. Boarding schools occupy a strange place in the public imagination, both respected and resented, admired and suspected. For some locals, the disappearance confirmed long-held discomfort with a place that felt closed off and secretive. For others, it was unthinkable that such a respected institution could harbor danger. Their stories reflected these biases, shaping blame to fit pre-existing opinions. Parents of other students clung fiercely to explanations that minimized risk. Runaways could be understood, even sympathized with. Random harm was harder to reconcile with the decision to send a child away. The stories people chose revealed what they needed to protect. Beliefs about safety, about authority, about their own judgment. Truth became secondary to reassurance. Inside the school, rumors spread in quieter, more volatile ways. Students whispered in hallways and bathrooms, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations, misinterpreting adult behavior. Filling gaps with imagination, fear sharpened their storytelling, turning uncertainty into menace. Every locked door felt suspicious. Every stern look from a teacher gained new meaning. The girl's disappearance became a lens through which everything else was viewed. Teachers and administrators, too, told themselves stories, though they framed them in professional language. They spoke of likelihoods and probabilities, of teenage impulsiveness, of statistical patterns. These narratives allowed them to continue functioning, to maintain an appearance of competence, admitting that they did not know, that the situation defied explanation, threatened their sense of control. Stories became a form of armor. For the families of the missing girls, stories were both refuge and torment. Hope demanded narratives where the girls were alive, somewhere warm, somewhere safe. At the same time, hope prolonged agony, stretching days into endless waiting. Each new theory offered a brief surge of possibility, followed by crushing disappointment when it led nowhere. The families learned to live inside uncertainty. their emotional lives shaped by stories they did not fully believe but could not let go of. Media attention added another layer. Reporters arrived seeking clarity, and in the absence of facts, they turned to speculation. Headlines framed possibilities as questions, and questions as implications. Public imagination widened the scope of the mystery, pulling in archetypes of danger and rebellion. The girls were no longer just students. They became symbols onto which strangers projected their own fears about youth control and vulnerability. As the days turned into weeks, certain narratives began to solidify. Repetition gave them weight. The runaway theory, in particular, gained traction because it aligned neatly with cultural expectations. Teenage girls leaving together felt plausible, almost familiar. It required no villain, no institutional failure, no uncomfortable questions. It offered closure without evidence. In some circles, it became accepted truth, spoken with the confidence usually reserved for proven facts. Other possibilities faded not because they were disproven, but because they were too unsettling to sustain. The idea that something could happen within the school without leaving traces challenged a belief in oversight and safety. It suggested that order might be an illusion, maintained only until the moment it failed. People turned away from that thought instinctively, choosing stories that preserved a sense of stability. Yet beneath the dominant narratives, doubt persisted. Some details refused to align. The lack of preparation, the absence of communication, the snow that recorded nothing. These inconsistencies nagged at those willing to sit with discomfort. But doubt is quiet and certainty is loud. Over time, the louder stories drowned out the softer questions. The community learned how easily a mystery could be reshaped by repetition. Each retelling smoothed edges, removed contradictions, made the story easier to digest. Complexity was sacrificed for coherence. Time did what it always does when answers refuse to appear. It moved forward anyway. Days slipped into weeks, weeks into months, and the intensity that once gripped the school and the surrounding community began to loosen, not because a mystery had been resolved, but because life demanded motion. The search teams left. The patrol cars disappeared from the roads. The constant questioning slowed, then stopped. What remained was an open case and a quiet understanding that it no longer occupied the center of anyone's attention, except those who could not afford to let it go. The school attempted to restore its rhythm, but the effort felt strained, almost performative. Bells rang on schedule. Lessons resumed. Rules were enforced with renewed rigidity. Order became a statement rather than a habit, a way of insisting that nothing fundamental had been broken. Students returned to class with a heightened awareness of their surroundings, but they were expected to behave as if nothing had changed. Grief and fear had no place in the timetable. Empty beds were reassigned. Lockers were cleaned out. Personal items were boxed and labeled, their significance reduced to inventory. These acts were framed as necessity, but they carried a deeper message. Absence must be managed. The institution could not allow itself to be defined by what it could not explain. The missing girls were slowly removed from daily life, not out of malice, but out of practicality. Remembering them too vividly made the continuation of routine impossible. Officially, the investigation remained open. Unofficially, it began to drift toward the margins. Leads dried up. Tips arrived sporadically, each one reigniting hope briefly before dissolving into disappointment. Files grew thicker, but no clearer. Each new document felt like weight rather than progress. The case became something to be maintained rather than pursued, kept alive in theory, while momentum faded in practice. For the families, time behaved differently. It stretched and warped, refusing to move at the same pace as the world around them. Birthdays passed unmarked. Holidays arrived heavy with absence. Ordinary moments became reminders of what was missing. They learned the strange exhaustion of sustained uncertainty, the way hope and despair can coexist without canceling each other out. Waiting became a way of life. Rooms at home were left untouched, preserved as they had been on the last ordinary day. Clothes remained folded. Posters stayed on walls. Dust gathered slowly, respectfully. These spaces became private memorials to a future that never arrived. Family members navigated the delicate balance between holding on and moving forward, unsure which choice would feel more like betrayal. Public attention waned, as it inevitably does. New stories replaced old ones. The disappearance slipped from headlines to footnotes, mentioned occasionally in anniversary pieces or speculative retrospectives. Each mention reopened wounds for those closest to the girls, while for others it barely registered. The case had entered a new phase, one defined by distance and abstraction. The school itself could not escape entirely. Whispers lingered, especially among new students who arrived knowing only fragments of the story. The building carried a subtle stigma, a sense that something unresolved clung to its walls. Administrators responded by emphasizing achievements, traditions, anything that reinforced legitimacy. The disappearance was treated as an unfortunate anomaly, a rare disruption in an otherwise exemplary history. Years passed, and the school eventually closed, not because of the case, but for reasons unrelated and bureaucratic. Declining enrollment, financial strain, changing educational priorities. The official explanation made no mention of the girls, yet their absence hovered over the decision like an unspoken factor. When the doors finally shut, it felt to some like a quiet admission that the institution had never fully recovered. The building fell into disuse, its corridors gathering dust, its classrooms emptied of voices. Nature began to reclaim the grounds, vines creeping along stone, snow piling up undisturbed in winter. The place that had once insisted on order now surrendered to entropy. For those who remembered, the decay felt symbolic, though no one said so aloud. The case files followed a similar trajectory. Active investigation gave way to archival storage. Boxes were sealed, labeled, shelved. Paperwork that once represented urgency became history. The language of reports grew more formal, more distant, as if emotion had been edited out over time. The case was no longer something happening, but something that had happened and never finished happening. For investigators who had once worked the case, it became one among many, recalled occasionally with a shake of the head, a comment about how some mysteries simply refused resolution. For younger officers, it was a cold case, stripped of immediacy, defined by documents rather than faces. The girls' names existed now primarily on paper, separated from the lives they once described. Yet even as the world moved on, the disappearance resisted full erasure. It lingered in small ways. The box did not stand out at first. It sat among hundreds of others, identical in size and color, stacked with a careful indifference that only time can produce. Cardboard faded to the same muted shade, labels typed in the same utilitarian font. To anyone else, it would have been just another artifact of finished past, one more piece of administrative debris waiting to be cataloged and forgotten again. But history rarely announces its turning points. It waits for someone patient enough to notice the quiet anomalies. The archivist had been working through the collection for weeks, guided not by urgency, but by habit. The task was routine the way that deep, methodical work often is. Open, verify, log, reshelve. The archive itself felt detached from the world above it, insulated by concrete walls and controlled climate. Time behaved differently there. Years flattened into paper, and urgency dissolved into procedure. It was a label that caused a pause, not because it was dramatic, but because it was slightly wrong. A date that didn't align. A department code that fell out of place. Small errors are the language of buried stories, and as someone trained to read them, they carry weight. The archivist hesitated, then pulled the box free, feeling the faint resistance of cardboard that hadn't been moved in decades. Inside, the contents were orderly, almost reverent. Folders stacked carefully, documents clipped and categorized. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Forms, reports, correspondence, the familiar architecture of an institutional memory. But as the archivist began to read, a subtle unease set in. These were not copies. These were originals, and they had not been referenced anywhere in the existing catalog. The name appeared partway through, unremarkable until it wasn't. Then another, and another. Recognition arrived slowly, like a sensation returning to a limb after numbness. The case that lingered on the edges of local history, half remembered and rarely discussed, was here in ink and paper, heavier than memory, more precise than rumor. The archivist felt the shift immediately, not excitement, but responsibility. Reading became careful, deliberate. Every line was weighed against what was known, what had been accepted for years. There were memos that contradicted the official timeline, notes taken in margins that suggested uncertainty, where confidence had been recorded elsewhere. A meeting summary referenced a discussion that, according to public record, had never occurred. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, it suggested omission. The archivist had spent a career among forgotten materials and understood the difference between oversight and avoidance. This box felt like the latter. It had not been lost. It had been placed, filed where it would not be found unless someone noticed what didn't belong. The realization was unsettling, not because it implied malice necessarily, but because it revealed intention. As the hours passed, the archive seemed to grow quieter, as if sound itself were being absorbed by the weight of what was being read. The archivist took notes, cross-referenced dates, traced names through other collections. Each connection tightened the sense that this was not a footnote, but a missing chapter. The disappearance, long treated as an unresolved tragedy, suddenly felt incomplete in a different way. Not unsolved, but unfinished. There was no dramatic revelation, no single document that explained everything. Instead, there was accumulation, a pattern of hesitation, language that softened certain actions while emphasizing others. Decisions framed as procedural that carried moral weight. The archivist felt the slow burn of understanding, the kind that leaves no room for denial. Bringing the material forward required caution. Archives are not neutral spaces. They are governed by policies, permissions, hierarchies. To surface something like this meant navigating institutional sensitivities decades in the making. The archivist consulted quietly, sharing findings with select colleagues, gauging reactions. The responses ranged from disbelief to discomfort to something that looked very much like recognition. What emerged was a shared understanding that the case, as it had been remembered, was incomplete by design, not falsified outright, but shaped, simplified, smoothed into something easier to store away. The box challenged that version of events, not by accusing, but by revealing what had been left unsaid. The archivist reached out to authorities, framing the discovery carefully, not as accusation, but as clarification. Documents had been found. They had relevance. They raised questions that had never been formally addressed. The language was measured, professional, but the implications were clear. A door long closed was being nudged open. The response was cautious, as expected. Interest expressed. Procedures outlined. The past is always inconvenient when it refuses to stay buried. Yet there was movement, requests for copies, meetings scheduled. The case, dormant for decades, stirred. For the archivist, the experience was transformative in a quiet way. The documents did not reveal themselves all at once. They demanded patience, the kind that comes from sitting with discomfort rather than rushing toward resolution. Each page added texture instead of clarity, and the archivist began to understand that what had been hidden was not a single truth, but a series of choices. Choices about what to record, what to emphasize, and what to quietly set aside. Some of the earliest pages were mundane on the surface. Internal communications that read like hundreds of others, written in cautious language, dense with procedural phrasing. But beneath that neutrality, patterns began to emerge. Phrases repeated across memos, identical wording used to describe different events, as if someone had been careful to standardize not just actions, but interpretations. The language did not lie outright. It softened, it redirected, it avoided. There were witness statements that felt oddly restrained, stripped of emotion in ways that did not align with the circumstances. Students who had been interviewed shortly after the disappearance described moments of unease, conversations that felt unfinished, behaviors that seemed out of character at the time. Yet in the official summaries, these details were reduced to vague references, their specificity lost. The archivist noticed the difference between what had been said and what had been preserved. A particular set of notes stood out, handwritten rather than typed, margins crowded with quick observations. They belonged to someone who had clearly felt urgency, who had noticed inconsistencies early on. Questions were underlined, timelines circled. There was frustration in the pen's strokes, a sense of someone pushing against a structure that did not welcome disruption. These notes never appear to have been formally filed. They existed alongside the record, not within it. Cross-referencing those notes with the official timeline revealed subtle but meaningful gaps. Certain hours were accounted for too neatly, as if uncertainty had been ironed out. A staff member's movements were recorded with precision in one document and left vague in another. A meeting reference in correspondence did not appear in any official log. None of these discrepancies screamed wrongdoing on their own. Together, they formed a quiet dissonance that refused to resolve. One folder contained disciplinary records unrelated at first glance to the disappearance. Minor infractions, warnings issued, behavioral notes. But dates overlapped in unsettling ways. Patterns emerged around enforcement, around certain students receiving disproportionate attention. The archivist resisted drawing conclusions too quickly, but the proximity of these records to the case felt intentional, as if someone had believed context mattered, even if they had not been allowed to say why. There were letters as well, sent and unsent, drafts that never reached their recipients. One in particular was addressed to a regional authority, its tone careful but insistent. It raised concerns about internal practices, about how incidents were being handled. The letter stopped short of accusation, but its presence suggested tension behind closed doors. There was no record of it being mailed. Instead, it had been folded, unfolded, and finally filed away. As the archivist continued, the emotional weight of the material deepened. This was not the discovery of a hidden villain, or a dramatic cover-up in the way stories often promise. It was more unsettling than that. It was a realization that truth can be eroded through restraint, through the collective decision to prioritize stability over transparency. Nothing in the box suggested panic. Everything suggested control. The archivist shared copies with investigators, who approached the material with measured skepticism. Cold cases teach caution. Hope can be dangerous when it outruns evidence. But as they read, their questions mirrored those that had already formed. Why were certain leads dismissed so quickly? Why were internal concerns reframed as misunderstandings? Why did the official narrative feel smoother than reality usually allows? One investigator noted how the documents seemed designed to close doors rather than open them. Leads were labeled unlikely. Behaviors were described as typical. The language guided interpretation, steering readers away from discomfort. It was the kind of narrative shaping that doesn't announce itself, that only becomes visible when compared against what was left out. The archivist felt a growing sense of unease, not just about what had happened, but about how easily it had been accepted. The box had not required a conspiracy to remain hidden. It only required indifference and a system that rewarded order over inquiry. Once filed, it had waited quietly, protected by the assumption that everything worth knowing was already known. As the days passed, the material began to reshape the disappearance in subtle ways. The girls were no longer just absent figures around whom speculation swirled. They became points of convergence for institutional behavior. Their lives intersected with rules, with authority, with expectations that may have pressed too hard or listened too little. The mystery shifted from where they went to what they encountered before they were gone. There was no single page that delivered certainty, no moment where everything clicked into place. Instead, there was a growing awareness that the original investigation had been constrained by what it was willing to consider. Certain possibilities had been deemed too disruptive, too damaging to pursue fully, and so they had been noted, softened, and archived. The archivist wrestled with the implications. Releasing this material would not bring easy answers. It might not bring answers at all, but it would change the shape of question. It would force a reckoning with decisions made in the name of order, with the cost of silence disguised as professionalism. For investigators, the documents reopened old discomforts. They could not accuse the past outright, but they could no longer accept it uncritically. The case had to be reread, not as a failure to find evidence, but as a failure to follow it wherever it led. That distinction mattered. As copies circulated, carefully and quietly, the story of the disappearance shifted again, not toward resolution, but toward accountability. The archivist understood then that the shock was not in any single revelation, but in the cumulative effect of what had been written and never truly read. The past had not been empty. It had been full of warnings, questions, and hesitations that had been preserved but ignored. The box was returned to its shelf eventually, but it no longer felt inert. It had done its work. What had been hidden in plain sight was no longer silent. And even if the truth remained incomplete, it was now impossible to pretend that nothing had been there at all. What emerged from the documents was not the kind of truth people expect when they think of disappearance. There was no singular moment that could be circled in red, no dramatic confrontation frozen in time. Instead, the truth took shape slowly, almost reluctantly, as if it resisted being named. It was a truth made of proximity rather than spectacle, of pressure rather than violence, of systems behaving exactly as they were designed to behave, even when that design caused harm. The investigators began to see that the original search for an external threat may have been a misdirection from the start, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was safer. It allowed everyone involved to imagine danger as something that arrived from outside, something foreign and unmistakable. What the file suggested instead was something quieter and far more unsettling, that the conditions which preceded the disappearance had been normalized, accepted, and ultimately protected. There were indications that concerns had surfaced long before girls vanished. Not alarms, not accusations, but discomfort. Notes about behavior framed as adjustment issues. Observations about discipline described as necessary firmness. Moments where someone had noticed something was wrong but lacked the language or authority to challenge it directly. These concerns did not disappear. They were absorbed, translated into institutional vocabulary that drained them of urgency. The truth that began to take shape was not about a single decision, but about accumulation. Each small choice made sense in isolation. Each response followed protocol. Each omission could be justified as discretion. But together, they created an environment where vulnerability had nowhere to go, where speaking up carried risk, where silence was rewarded as maturity and compliance mistaken for resilience. Investigators struggled with how to frame what they were seeing. There was no clear crime in the traditional sense, no evidence of intent that could be prosecuted decades later. The harm, if it could be called that, lived in gray space, between responsibility and neglect, between care and control. The system had not acted out of cruelty. It had acted out of self-preservation. The more the case was re-examined, the clearer it became that certain possibilities had been quietly ruled out not because they lacked merit, but because they threatened the institution's stability. To fully investigate internal dynamics would have required scrutiny of authority, of rules, of practices that were considered foundational. It would have required admitting that discipline, when enforced without empathy, could become dangerous. That possibility had been too disruptive to pursue. This realization reframed the disappearance entirely. The girls were no longer simply missing. They became the final variable in an equation that had been building pressure for years. Whatever happened to them did not erupt suddenly. It emerged from a landscape shaped by expectation, silence, and unchecked control. The tragedy was not an anomaly. It was a consequence. For those revisiting the case, this was the hardest truth to sit with. Monsters are easier to condemn than systems. A single villain offers clarity and closure. A culture of quiet harm offers neither. It implicates everyone and no one at the same time. It resists the clean narrative arcs people crave. And it leaves behind a discomfort that cannot be resolved by punishment or apology. The investigators found themselves asking questions that had little to do with location or timeline. What happens when young people are taught that endurance is virtue, even when it hurts? What happens when authority is insulated from challenge? What happens when reputation matters more than listening? These were not questions that could be answered with evidence bags or witness statements. They belonged to ethics, to hindsight, to accountability that arrives too late. Families were approached carefully, with an awareness that what could be offered was not closure, but context. Some listened in silence. Some reacted with anger that had nowhere to go. The idea that the truth might be systemic rather than specific felt, to some, like another form of erasure. Without a clear answer, grief struggled to settle. Without a named cause, blame had no target. And yet, for others, the reframing brought a different kind of clarity. It validated feelings that had lingered unspoken for decades. The sense that something had been wrong long before the disappearance. That the girls had been navigating more than teenage restlessness. That their struggles had been invisible not because they were insignificant, but because the system was not built to see them. The case reached a point where further investigation promised diminishing returns. The past would be illuminated, but not altered. Accountability could be discussed, but not enforced. The truth that emerged did not fit neatly into legal frameworks or public expectations. It was not the truth of a crime, but a failure to care deeply enough, to question forcefully enough, to listen when listening was inconvenient. When modern investigators revisited the case, they did so in awareness that they were stepping into something fragile. Not fragile because it was old, but because it had been handled carefully for decades in a way that preserved its uncertainty. They approached the files with different tools than their predecessors, not just technological, but philosophical. The question was no longer only what happened, but why certain questions had never been allowed to fully form. They began by rereading everything, slowly, not skimming for conclusions, but examining tone, emphasis, absence. Where earlier investigators had looked for deviations from a norm, these readers questioned the norm itself. They noticed how quickly certain explanations had been labeled sufficient, how efficiently discomfort had been redirected into procedure. The case felt less like a mystery to be solved and more like a narrative to be unlearned. Advancements in forensic science offered little. Time had erased what little physical evidence might once have existed. Landscapes had changed. Buildings had decayed. Witnesses had aged, their memories softened or sharpened unpredictably by decades of reflection. Technology could not resurrect what had never been preserved. The investigators understood early on that this would not be a case resolved through discovery, but through interpretation. They spoke with people who had been young then and old now, whose recollections carried the weight of years spent living alongside unanswered questions. Some spoke with clarity, their memories vivid, shaped by repetition and regret. Others struggled to separate what they remembered from what they had been told. The investigators listened carefully, aware that memory is not a record but a process, constantly revised by emotion and meaning. What became clear was that the disappearance had shaped lives in ways both obvious and subtle. Former students described a lingering sense of unease that followed them into adulthood, a distrust of institutions that claimed to know what was best. Some had avoided positions of authority altogether. Others had sought them out, determined to do better. The case had not ended in the winter of that year. It had echoed forward, influencing choices no one had connected back to those missing girls. The investigators faced a dilemma familiar to anyone who reopens old wounds. How much clarity is enough when certainty is impossible? They could identify failures of oversight, patterns of silence, moments where intervention might have mattered. They could acknowledge that the original investigation had been shaped by assumptions that limited its scope, but they could not offer a final answer that satisfied the human need for resolution. Their conclusions were careful, almost restrained. They stopped short of declaring guilt or innocence, understanding that such declarations would oversimplify what they had uncovered. Instead, they spoke of context, of institutional culture, of missed opportunities to listen. They reframed the disappearance as a case study in how systems respond under pressure, and how those responses can inadvertently deepen harm. For the families, this reopening was both a gift and a burden. Being believed, even partially, carried its own weight. To hear investigators acknowledge that the original narrative had been incomplete validated years of private doubt, but it also reopened grief that had learned to survive in silence. Answers, when they arrive without resolution, can feel like another form of loss. Some family members wanted more. Names, accountability, something tangible to anchor their grief. Others found a measure of peace in knowing that the girl's disappearance was no longer dismissed as inexplicable or trivial, that it was being spoken about with seriousness and care, that their children were no longer just a mystery, but part of a larger truth about how easily voices can be overlooked. The investigators were transparent about the limits of their work. They did not promise closure, only honesty. They acknowledged what could not be known and resisted the urge to fill gaps with speculation. This restraint marked a departure from earlier efforts. Where one certainty had been prioritized, Now humility guided the process. In public statements, they chose their words carefully. They spoke of learning rather than solving, of responsibility rather than blame. The disappearance, they explained, did not yield to simple explanations because it was never simple to begin with. It was a result of intersecting pressures, expectations, and silences that had accumulated over time. This reframing did not satisfy everyone. Some criticized as evasive, as an unwillingness to confront hard truths. Others saw it as the most honest response possible given the evidence. What mattered, perhaps, was that the conversation itself had changed. The case was no longer frozen in the assumptions of the past. It had been reopened not just procedurally, but morally. The investigators closed their review with an understanding that justice does not always look like answers. Sometimes it looks like acknowledgement. The building no longer announces itself. Where bells once dictated the rhythm of every hour, there is only wind now, moving through broken windows and collapsed corridors without pattern or permission. Snow still comes in winter, settling into corners of rooms that once held desks, beds, lives. Nature has reclaimed what structure tried to control, and in doing so, it has made the silence feel intentional, almost deliberate. This is what remains when routine disappears and memory is left to speak for itself. Walking through the ruins, it becomes difficult to separate the past from the present. Paint peels in long, tired strips. Floors sag where hundreds of footsteps once passed every day. Light enters unevenly, catching dust in the air like suspended time. It is not hard to imagine the echoes here, not sounds exactly, but impressions. A laugh cut short, a whispered secret, a name spoken and answered once. The absence is not loud. It does not demand attention. It settles into the body slowly, the way unanswered questions always do. This place does not feel haunted in the way stories often promise. There are no sudden chills, no dramatic sensations. Instead, there is a steady, low awareness that something unfinished lingers, not tied to a single room or hallway, but embedded in the space itself. People who visit now often come out of curiosity. They know the story in fragments, softened by time and retelling. 3 girls, a winter, a mystery that never resolved. They walk carefully, taking photographs, speaking in hushed tones as if instinctively aware that this is not a place for noise. Some leave flowers. Others leave nothing but footprints that fade quickly. The building absorbs it all without response. For those who remember, the echoes are different. They are not visual or auditory. They are emotional, a feeling that resurfaces unexpectedly when passing an old school, when hearing a bell, when watching snow fall too quietly. Memory does not replay events accurately. It distills them into sensations, into impressions that resist language. What remains is not what happened, but what was lost. The girls themselves exist now mostly in those impressions. Photographs have aged. Faces once vivid have softened into familiarity without detail. Their names still appear in records, in files, in carefully worded summaries. But names alone cannot carry a life. What endures instead are the questions attached to them. The sense that they were here, that they mattered, that the world continued without answering for their absence. There is a temptation, after so much time, to seek meaning in the endurance of the mystery itself, to treat it as a cautionary tale, a symbol, a lesson neatly packaged for future generations. But doing so risks the same simplification that allowed the truth to remain hidden for so long. The story resists moral clarity. It does not resolve into a warning with clear instructions. It lingers because it refuses to be useful in that way. What echoes most powerfully is not the disappearance, but the forgetting that followed. Not intentional forgetting, not cruel dismissal, but the gradual erosion of urgency. The way unanswered questions slowly lose their sharpness as the world demands attention elsewhere. The way silence can become normal if left unchallenged long enough. In the years since the case was reopened, discussed, reframed, there has been no final reckoning, no courtroom, no definitive explanation. Some see this as failure. Others understand it as honesty. Not all stories end with clarity. Some end with responsibility. The responsibility to remember without rewriting, to acknowledge without resolving. The boarding school is gone, but the systems it represented are not. Institutions still prioritize order. Silence is still mistaken for stability. Discomfort is still smoothed over in the name of continuity. The disappearance does not belong solely to the past because the conditions that allowed it to fade are not confined to history. For the families, the ending never truly arrives. Grief does not conclude simply because time has passed. It changes shape, becomes quieter, less visible, but it does not disappear. There is no moment when the loss becomes acceptable. There is only the slow learning of how to live alongside it. Each new understanding brings relief and pain in equal measure. What the Archivist found did not close the story. It altered it. It pulled it back into the light, without pretending the light could solve it. The investigators did not finish the narrative. They interrupted the forgetting. And sometimes, that is the most meaningful act available. Standing in the empty dormitories, it becomes clear that haunting is not about ghosts. It is about presence without acknowledgement, about lives that intersected with a system that could not fully see them, about questions that were deferred until the people they concerned were no longer there to answer them. The echo is not in the walls. It is in the awareness that silence can be maintained, curated, even archived. That truths can be preserved without being acted upon. That time does not correct injustice on its own. It only distances us from the urgency of confronting it. The girls are not remembered as victims here. They are remembered as absences that refuse to settle into abstraction, as reminders that disappearance is not always an event, but sometimes a process, one that begins long before anyone notices and continues long after the search has ended. In the end, there is no final image, no closing statement that resolves the tension. The story does not conclude. It exhales. It leaves behind a quiet insistence that remembering is an active choice, not a passive one. That listening must happen before silence hardens into record. The boarding school will continue to decay. Snow will keep falling. Wind will keep moving through rooms that once held certainty. And somewhere within that quiet, the echo remains, not asking to be solved, but asking to be acknowledged. Long after the last page is turned and the last light in the archive is switched off, the story continues to exist in a quieter register. It lives not in documents or conclusions, but in the space between what is known and what is felt. This is where unresolved stories settle, not demanding attention, but refusing to disappear. The disappearance of the three girls had become one of those stories, less a mystery to be solved and a presence to be carried. For people who encounter the case now, often years or decades removed, it arrives without urgency. It is something read late at night, something listened to in passing, something absorbed as atmosphere rather than fact. And yet, for reasons that are difficult to articulate, it lingers. It resists being forgotten because it mirrors a deeper unease many people recognize instinctively. The fear that systems designed to protect can also erase, that silence can masquerade as safety, that absence can be managed rather than confronted. There is no clean emotional release at the end of this story, no final revelation that rearranges everything into order. What remains instead is a tension that never fully dissolves. The sense that the truth was not stolen or destroyed, but misplaced, set aside carefully, deliberately, and left to gather dust until its relevance was almost lost. That kind of truth does not return with force. It returns slowly, asking to be considered rather than consumed. In the years following the renewed attention, conversations have shifted in subtle ways. Educators speak more carefully about discipline and care. Archivists revisit collections with sharper eyes, aware that misfiled history is still history. Investigators question not only what is missing, but why it might be missing. These changes are small, almost invisible, but they matter. They are ripples rather than waves, and ripples are easy to underestimate. The families of the girls live with an ending that never arrived. Their lives have been divided not into before and after, but into before and always. They have learned that grief does not demand resolution in order to persist. It adapts. It becomes quieter, less legible to outsiders, but it never fully loosens its grip. Hope, too, changes shape. It no longer looks like rescue or return. It looks like recognition, like honesty, like the refusal to let the story be flattened into something easier to carry. For those who once attended the school, The memory surfaces unexpectedly, in dreams, in moments of authority, in the uneasy awareness that rules can feel different depending on who enforces them and who must obey. Many have gone on to live ordinary lives, yet the winter of the disappearance remains embedded in their sense of the world. It taught them, whether they realize it or not, that certainty is fragile, and that silence often hides complexity rather than clarity. The case has become a quiet reference point, not because it offers answers, but because it offers perspective. It reminds us that disappearance is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is incremental. Sometimes it happens while bells are still ringing, while schedules are still being followed, while everyone believes the system is working. By the time absence is recognized as absence, it is already settled too deeply to trace. What endures most powerfully is the idea that the girls were never truly invisible. They were seen, noted, written about, discussed. And yet, being seen did not mean being understood. Records existed. Observations were made. Concerns were documented. What failed was not memory, but response. The difference between knowing and acting proved vast enough to swallow 3 lives whole. This is not a story that offers comfort, but it offers something else, an invitation to sit with complexity rather than flee from it, to resist the urge to resolve every mystery into a moral, to accept that some endings are not endings at all, but continuations shaped by how we choose to remember. The Archivist did not uncover a secret so much as a pattern. The investigators did not expose a crime so much as a culture. The audience does not receive closure so much as responsibility. Responsibility to listen differently, to question smoother narratives, to notice what feels slightly wrong and not dismiss it simply because it is inconvenient. In this way, the story becomes less about the girls and more about the space they revealed, a space where silence is curated, where discomfort is managed, where truth can wait patiently for decades without disappearing. That space exists in many places, not just one boarding school in one winter long ago. Recognizing it is uncomfortable. Ignoring it is easier. As time continues its steady movement forward, the case will fade again from public conversation. That is inevitable. Stories cannot remain in focus forever. But fading is not the same as vanishing. What has been seen cannot be unseen. What has been acknowledged cannot be entirely undone. Even when attention moves on, understanding remains, carried quietly by those who encountered it deeply. There is no final image to hold on to,